Welcome to Dark Mysteries. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying stories, I have one question. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. If you want more nights filled with horror, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, dim the lights and step into the darkness. Every park ranger at Yellowstone knows about the Zone of Death. 50 square miles of Idaho that technically falls within the park's jurisdiction, but exists in a legal void where, theoretically, you could commit any crime without prosecution. But veteran ranger Tom Mitchell discovered something far worse than legal loopholes in that forgotten corner of wilderness. Some zones are dead for reasons that have nothing to do with law. Tom had been with the Park Service for 18 years when he was assigned to investigate a series of missing hiker reports near the Idaho section. 7 people in 3 months, all experienced outdoorsmen, all vanishing within the same 5-mile radius. The area wasn't particularly dangerous. No cliffs, no predator problems, no extreme weather patterns. Just forest that had been there since before humans walked the continent. The first thing Tom noticed was the silence. Yellowstone is never truly quiet. Even in winter, there's wind, birds, the distant sound of geothermal activity. But in the Zone of Death, sound seemed to die after traveling just a few feet. His radio, rated for 30 miles, barely worked at 1. His GPS showed his location, then didn't, then showed him somewhere impossible. Coordinates that placed him miles underground. He found the first clue 3 miles in. A campsite, perfectly preserved. Not abandoned, but preserved, like someone had frozen it in time. The fire still had warm coals despite the missing hiker report being 2 weeks old. The tent fabric showed no weather wear. And inside the tent, Tom found something that made him question his sanity. A journal, the hiker's journal, with entries dated 3 days in the future. The entries described Tom's arrival, described what he was wearing, what equipment he carried, even what he'd eaten for breakfast. But the final entry was different. The ranger thinks he's investigating disappearances. He doesn't understand. We didn't disappear. We're still here, we're all still here. Time just works differently past the trees that grow in circles. Tom looked up from the journal and saw them. Trees, massive lodgepole pines growing in perfect circles throughout the forest. He'd studied forestry, knew this wasn't natural. Trees don't grow in geometric patterns without human intervention, but these trees were centuries old, older than any human settlement in the area. He approached the nearest circle, maybe 30 feet in diameter. The moment he stepped inside, Yellowstone vanished. Not disappeared, but vanished, as if it had never existed. The forest was the same, but different. The trees were younger and older simultaneously. The sun was at the wrong angle for the time of day. And standing in the center of the circle was a hiker, one of the missing 7. But the hiker wasn't right. He stood perfectly still, eyes open but unseeing. When Tom called out, the man's head turned with mechanical precision. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere except his mouth. "Day 743 of my 3-day hike," the hiker said. "Or is it minute 3 of day 743? Time moves in all directions here. I've been walking for years. I left camp 10 seconds ago. I'm still at home planning this trip. I'm already dead. I'm not born yet." Tom tried to approach, but the hiker held up a hand. "Don't come closer. The circles are doors, but they only open one way. I went through forward. You'd go through backward. Backward is worse. Backward means you ungrow, unlearn, unbecome. The others learned that." That's when Tom saw the others. All 7 missing hikers, standing in different circles throughout the forest. All perfectly still. All talking without moving their mouths. They explained, in their horrible chorus voice, what the zone of death really was. It wasn't a legal anomaly, it was a temporal one. A place where time had broken, shattered like glass, and reformed wrong. The Native Americans had known, marked it with warnings that white settlers ignored. The government had known, created the legal loophole to keep people away without admitting the truth. Because how do you tell the public that there's a part of Yellowstone where causality fails, where you can meet yourself coming back from a hike you haven't taken yet? Tom documented everything, took photos that would later show nothing but static, recorded voices that would play back as his own voice speaking words he'd never said. He marked the GPS coordinates of each circle, though his device insisted he was simultaneously at all of them and none of them. The worst part came when he tried to leave. Every path out led back in. Every step away brought him closer. The forest had noticed him noticing it, and things that exist outside normal time don't like being observed by things that don't. He finally escaped by following the one piece of advice the frozen hikers gave him. Don't think about leaving. Think about having already left. Remember returning home. Remember filing your report. Remember it as if it already happened. Because here it has. Here, everything has already happened and never happened, and is happening right now. Tom closed his eyes and remembered. Remembered driving away. Remembered typing his report. Remembered quitting the Park Service and moving to Florida. And when he opened his eyes, he was in his truck, parked at the zone's entrance, engine running. His GPS showed he'd been gone for 3 minutes. His phone showed he'd been gone for 3 weeks. The calendar in his truck said it was next year. He drove away and never looked back. But sometimes, Tom gets calls from his own number. When he answers, he hears his own voice, still in the zone, still investigating, warning him not to come, not to investigate, not to become what he already is. Because in the zone of death, every timeline is true, and somewhere, Tom Mitchell never left. The Park Service still gets missing hiker reports from that area. They don't send rangers anymore. They just mark the cases cold and add them to the list. Because some zones are dead for reasons that have nothing to do with law, and some deaths happen outside the boundaries of time itself. Sarah Blackwood had monitored Old Faithful's eruptions for 6 years, but she'd never worked the night shift until budget cuts left them short-staffed. That's when she learned why the senior researchers always found excuses to leave before dark, why the seismic equipment was turned off at sunset, and why the Native American tribes called this place where the earth breathes wrong. Old Faithful erupts every 90 minutes, give or take. It's predictable, reliable, the most famous geyser in the world. Millions of tourists have watched it perform, but they only see the daytime shows. Sarah discovered that after midnight, Old Faithful puts on a very different performance for a very different audience. Her first night shift started normally. She checked the instruments, logged the 10:47 p.m. eruption, settled in for a quiet evening of data entry. But at 12:17 a.m., exactly between scheduled eruptions, the ground began to vibrate. Not the usual pre-eruption tremors, but something rhythmic, like breathing, like something massive, inhaling and exhaling beneath the thermal features. Sarah checked the seismographs. They showed impossible readings. Movement not from below, but from above, as if gravity had reversed. The thermal cameras revealed heat signatures around the geyser, dozens of them. But when she looked out the window, the viewing area was empty. Then, Old Faithful erupted. 17 minutes early, and the water was wrong. Instead of shooting skyward, the superheated water formed shapes, figures, dancing, writhing forms that stood for impossible moments before dissolving into steam. And in that steam, Sarah saw faces, human faces, twisted in expressions of ecstasy or agony, she couldn't tell which. The eruption lasted exactly 93 seconds, and when it ended, the night was silent. Too silent. She called her supervisor, Dr. Henderson, who answered on the first ring despite it being past midnight. His voice was tired, resigned. "You saw them," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lock the door, don't go outside, don't look directly at the geyser again, and whatever you do, don't let them know you can see them." Dr. Henderson explained what the Park Service had hidden for decades. Old Faithful wasn't just a geyser. It was a release valve for something far older than Yellowstone, something that had been trapped beneath the caldera long before humans evolved. Every eruption released not just water and steam, but pressure from a prison that should never be opened. The night eruptions were different because that's when the prisoners tested their cage. The things that came up with the steam weren't ghosts or spirits. They were something else, something that existed in the superheated water below, in temperatures that should kill any form of life. But they weren't alive in any sense we understood. They were patterns, consciousnesses encoded in the mineral deposits, in the very chemistry of the geothermal system. The Native Americans knew, Henderson said. They held ceremonies here not to worship, but to reinforce the prison. When we took over, we turned it into a tourist attraction. We forgot that some natural wonders are wonderful because they're keeping something terrible at bay. Sarah watched the monitors as 1:47 a.m. approached, the next scheduled eruption. This time, she knew what to look for. The heat signatures gathered first, hundreds of them, forming circles around the geyser. They stood in patterns that hurt to perceive, geometric arrangements that seemed to fold space wrong. And when Old Faithful erupted, she heard it. Not with her ears, but in her bones, in her teeth, in the fluid of her eyes. Singing, or screaming, or both. Frequencies that human ears weren't meant to process, telling stories of the time before cooling, when the earth was molten and things that couldn't exist in solid matter swam freely in the liquid stone. They wanted out, had always wanted out. And every eruption weakened their prison just a little bit more. The worst part was the offer they made. Every night shift worker heard it eventually. The promise whispered in the steam, let them out, just once. Just for a moment, and they would share secrets. How to predict earthquakes, how to harness unlimited geothermal energy, how to survive the supervolcano eruption that was coming sooner than anyone publicly admitted. All they needed was someone to adjust the pressure valves, to change the monitoring equipment, to create the right conditions for a prison break that had been brewing for millions of years. Sarah found the logs hidden in the monitoring station. Dozens of night shift workers over the decades, all reporting the same phenomena. Some had tried to warn the public. They were dismissed as crackpots. Some had accepted the offer. They were the ones whose bodies were found in the thermal features, boiled alive but smiling, their final expression suggesting they'd seen something wonderful before they died. At 3:17 a.m., between eruptions, they came for her directly. The door she'd locked on Henderson's advice began to steam. The metal grew soft, pliable. Through the melting steel, she saw them clearly for the first time. Beautiful and terrible, geometric and organic. Patterns of living heat that had been waiting so long they'd forgotten what they were waiting for, only that they needed to be free. Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She turned on every piece of monitoring equipment, set them all to maximum sensitivity, and created a feedback loop. The screech of overloaded sensors filled the station, a sound painful enough to shatter coffee mugs and crack windows. The heat beings recoiled, their forms dispersing. They couldn't stand the sound of their own prison being monitored, documented, observed. She survived until dawn when the senior staff arrived and found her surrounded by destroyed equipment, clutching printouts that showed impossible readings, talking about living heat and geometric prisoners. They gave her paid leave, suggested counseling, never let her work nights again. But Sarah knows the truth. Old Faithful is counting down to something. Every eruption is a tick of a geological clock, and one day, probably soon, the timer will reach 0. The prison will fail. And the things that have been trapped since the Earth was young will swim free in the atmosphere, turning the air itself into something that burns with consciousness. The Park Service knows. They've known for decades. That's why they're so precise about predicting eruptions, so careful about monitoring. They're not studying Old Faithful, they're guarding it. And every night, when the tourists go home and the geyser performs for its real audience, another small piece of the prison breaks. If you visit Yellowstone, watch Old Faithful during the day. Take your pictures, buy your souvenirs, but leave before dark. Because the night shift isn't there to monitor the geyser. They're there to make sure that what comes up goes back down. And sometimes they fail. Wildlife photographer Jake Morrison had spent 3 months in Yellowstone's Lamar Valley documenting wolves. He knew every pack, every trail, every hidden spot where animals gathered. But on his final week, he discovered why the wolf packs avoided the northern section after the first snowfall, why no animals drank from certain streams, and why the Park Service had quietly removed all trail markers from a 40-acre section they called the Blank. Jake first noticed something was wrong when reviewing his telephoto shots. In the background of his wolf photos, he kept seeing the same group of elk, not similar elk, the exact same ones, in the exact same positions, 20 miles apart, photographed on different days. They stood perfectly still in every image, facing the same direction, toward a section of valley that maps labeled but showed no features. He decided to investigate, hiking into the unmarked area early one morning. The moment he crossed into the Blank, his equipment went haywire. Camera, autofocus hunting for subjects that weren't there. GPS spinning wildly, even his mechanical compass needle pointing straight down. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of his own heartbeat, growing louder with each step. A mile in, he found them. The elk from his photos, standing in a perfect line, unmoving. He approached slowly, camera ready, but as he got closer he realized they weren't breathing, weren't blinking. Their fur moved in the breeze, but the animals themselves were frozen mid-step, mid-chew, mid-breath. They were alive, his thermal scope confirmed that, but they existed in a single moment, stretched infinitely. Behind the elk, he found more animals, dozens of them. Wolves, bears, birds, even insects, all frozen in single moments. And among them, people. Hikers, their clothes dating back decades, suspended mid-stride. A park ranger from the 1970s, hand reaching for a radio that would never connect. A Native American hunter, traditional dress suggesting centuries of suspension. Arrow half drawn on a bow that would never release. Jake tried to touch one of the frozen hikers, but his hand stopped an inch from their skin, hitting resistance like thick glass. The air around each frozen figure was solid. Time itself crystallized into an impenetrable barrier. He could walk around them, see them from every angle, but they existed in bubbles of stopped time that nothing could penetrate. His camera captured everything, or so he thought. But when he reviewed the images later, they showed something different. In the photos, the frozen figures were moving, just infinitely slowly. A step that would take 1,000 years to complete. A blink that would last a century. They weren't frozen. They were trapped in time, moving at a different speed. Then he found the source. In the center of the Blank stood a formation that shouldn't exist. A perfect sphere of obsidian, 20 feet in diameter, hovering 3 feet off the ground. No supports, no explanation, just black glass that reflected nothing despite the morning sun. And around it, the concentration of frozen figures was highest, packed so densely he had to squeeze between them. As Jake approached the sphere, time began to feel thick, syrupy. His movements slowed, each step taking more effort than the last. His watch, a mechanical self-winder, began running backward. His digital camera displayed dates that jumped between past and future. And in the sphere's surface he saw himself, not reflected, but recorded. Every moment he'd existed in the valley played simultaneously on the obsidian surface. He saw himself arriving 3 months ago, setting up camp, taking his first wolf photo. He saw himself leaving next week, packing his gear, driving away. He saw himself as an old man, returning to the valley decades later. He saw himself being born, dying, existing in every moment of his life at once. And he understood what the blank really was. It was a knot in time, a place where past, present, and future had tangled together, creating a temporal dead zone. The sphere wasn't causing it. The sphere was documenting it, recording every moment that passed through the valley, storing them, playing them back in an endless loop. The frozen figures weren't trapped. They were echoes, temporal fossils left behind when they passed through the knot. Jake realized with growing horror that he was leaving echoes too. Every step he'd taken in the blank had created another frozen Jake, another moment crystallized in time. He could see them now, dozens of himself, each one a second behind the last, a trail of temporal breadcrumbs leading from the valley entrance to the sphere. He ran, but running created more echoes. He could see them multiplying behind him, an army of frozen Jakes, all suspended in their escape attempts. The valley didn't want to let him go. It wanted to keep him, to add him to its collection of moments. He felt time pulling at him, trying to slow him down, to freeze him like the others. At the valley's edge, Jake made a desperate decision. He destroyed his watch, his camera, everything that measured or recorded time. Without references, without anchors to normal time, he became temporally invisible to the blank. He stumbled out, gasping, aging a year in a second as time reasserted itself. The Park Service found him 3 days later, delirious, claiming months had passed. His hair had grown 6 inches overnight. His camera's memory card held 10,000 photos that couldn't have been taken in the 3 hours he was gone. And every photo showed the same thing: Jake, frozen in the blank, standing among centuries of trapped moments, his face turned toward a camera that hadn't been invented yet. The Park Service expanded the restricted zone, added more warnings, never admitted what they knew. But satellite images sometimes show movement in the blank. The frozen figures shifting positions when no one's watching. The sphere growing larger. And sometimes, on clear nights, you can see lights in the valley. The flash of cameras that don't exist yet, wielded by photographers who haven't been born, documenting moments that haven't happened. Jake never returned to Yellowstone. But he knows he's still there, in the blank, frozen in every moment he passed through. And sometimes, when he looks at his old photos, he sees himself in the background. An older version, a younger version, all the versions, all trapped in the valley that collects time like others collect stamps. The blank is still there, still growing, still collecting moments. Every animal that passes through, every hiker who ignores the warnings, every ranger who investigates, leaves an echo. And someday, when the blank has collected enough time, enough moments, the sphere will do something with its collection. something that will make everyone understand why some valleys should remain unmarked on maps.